Strangely enough, my excessive passion for video games has only really been a thing for the last 6 years of my life or so. As a child, we always had one console or another present underneath the television, but I was never really that interested. On the rare occasions it was turned on, I would inevitably be playing one of the many action platformers that were so popular amongst the youth at that time. As a largely unknowing, uncaring young chap, I pretty much enjoyed everything I played, specifically Insomniac's early titles, which of course includes Ratchet & Clank. It might be important to note that it hasn't actually been that long since the last game in the series. Into the Nexus was only released back in 2013, and whilst it introduced some fairly interesting new mechanics, the gameplay was still largely the same. Though seeing as we're in the midst of a new console generation, you can't exactly begrudge Sony for wanting to make one of their more established IPs relevant to a new audience. This newest instalment in the series, as you've probably already heard by now, is more of a reimagining of the first game, rather than a fleshed out, more distinct reboot of the franchise as a whole. It does, however, take some of the more interesting elements from previous games, mostly general gameplay improvements and some additional minor RPG elements. There's some neat weapons we've not seen before too, but for the most part it's all very familiar. The game it's alright. While still extremely basic, the combat has a nice flow to it. 4 weapons of choice can be mapped to the directional buttons on the DualShock for ease of access, whilst the rest are just an additional few button presses away. The majority of the weapons have a nice variety to them and are mostly fun to use. Some are largely situational, whilst most will be your standard go-tos for close or long-range combat. All of them can be upgraded in the standard fashion, and it's still as cool as it ever was. Enemy design is quite nice too. In fact, the art direction in general is quite lovely. It follows the usual cutesy style that's become so heavily affiliated with the genre at this stage, but it all looks great, with the current gen sheen applied to it at least. In this respect, Insomniac have done a really great job. The game's general performance, however, is where the game starts to lose me. Whilst I encountered very few bugs throughout the entirety of my playthrough, and the game, as far as I could tell, never really dipped below 30 frames, it was still nevertheless locked at 30 frames. Now, I'm not a performance junkie. Whilst my preferred platform is the PC, I'm not a 60 frames fascist. But with a game that's as shiny and wonderful to look at as this, there's no denying that a higher frame rate would have made for a smoother and generally more enjoyable experience. In what I can only assume was Insomniac's attempt to make the game appear smoother than it really is, the motion blur has been cranked up to 10. I've never liked motion blur in any game, and would rather have to contend with the slight stuttering than the way this feature attempts to smooth things out. Whilst I can appreciate that these things are both subjective, and this isn't necessarily a significant gripe, this is a review, and reviews by their definition are entirely subjective. About a third of the way through the game, I started to become less enchanted by the game's whimsical art style and instead started to become increasingly bored. A few beats in the rehashed story have been changed, assumedly to accommodate for the flick that'll be hitting the big screen soon, but it's basically the one I played when I was a teen. The gameplay too, despite minor changes and general improvements, still feels as basic and accommodating as it always has. Whilst that's not necessarily meant as a criticism, it nevertheless feels far too old hat for a series veteran like myself. Therein lies the inherent problem with the game, I think. Where many long-time fans will rejoice in the game's clear-cut and honest retelling of the original, others like myself will see a somewhat enjoyable but largely trite attempt to present us with a fat juicy slice of nostalgia pie. But Chris, you've just reviewed Dark Souls and admitted yourself that that is in and of itself a best-of package of previous instalments. This is true, and in fact a great comparison I can utilise to help strengthen my point. See, Dark Souls 3 is very aware of its roots. In many ways it does exactly what Ratchet & Clank does, in reusing and rehashing certain aspects of its series design. But where Ratchet & Clank reuses pretty much everything, Dark Souls 3 juxtaposes certain old elements with fresh new ideas, often surprising and enthralling series veterans. It's still inherently a Dark Souls game that borrows heavily from its predecessors, but in many ways it outshines them simply by reshaping and refining many of those core concepts. In Ratchet & Clank, nothing feels as wholly original or as interestingly reimagined. It's all just there, like it was and always will be. It might be shinier and more interesting to behold, and hell, it's better than getting a HD re-release I suppose, but it just seems like such a waste of effort to just do the same thing again. At present, I can only really recommend this to those of you who don't have an extended history with the series. It is fun, and it's always nice to see devs utilise these shiny new systems to show the full spectrum of colour where many others choose to ignore it. But for anyone who's played any excess of the series in the past, I honestly can't recommend it. Though of course, all this negativity could just be the remaining fallout from Sunset Overdrive. Insomniac, just hire some new writers for Christ's sake.